I'm ready. Okay. Hi, Carl. Good morning. Well, folks, good morning. Happy Easter. I'm sure I'll be saying that again once we get into our sermon here in a little bit, but can't say it too many times, right? All right, we're going to be picking up with our lesson from Matthew this morning and looking at chapter 17 again. So we sort of, when we started talking about this passage, highlighted the fact that there's going to be a lot to talk about when it comes to the Transfiguration. This is a sort of an important time in Jesus' ministry, especially when it comes to the relationship between him and his apostles, because now think about what we've seen from the apostles up to this point. These guys have been living with Jesus for maybe a couple of years at this point. Who knows how much time has passed? Somebody does. I don't, is my point. But they've been spending enough time with him that they know him fairly well. But every time he does a miracle, they seem to be surprised. Remember how the feeding the 5,000, they get in the boat and then he walks to them on water and suddenly they're surprised. Well, there's Jesus walking in the water. And then gets to the other side and he feeds more people miraculously again, and they're surprised when that thing that they've already seen happens for a second time. And so I guess it shouldn't be surprising how surprised they are when things happen. But here's probably the most significant thing, because going from being an extraordinary man, who may be the one that they've been looking for, as Peter said in the last chapter, the Christ, the one that they were looking for, forward to arriving from Scripture's prophecy. But they didn't really seem to understand the full significance of that, at least how it comes to their reaction to Jesus' confirmation as that role, right? Because he's got Moses and Elijah, the two guys who could have been said to have been a kind of anointed one of God prior, someone who had that role of being a prophet and a leader of the people. And they see these two guys here with Jesus, and we're finally getting to verse 4 and Peter's reaction to that. We looked at 3 verses on last time we were together, and so we finally are going to make a little bit more progress here. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Now, your King James, if you're reading from that translation, will probably say tabernacles instead, if my memory serves correctly. The translation's not especially important, but the idea is something along the lines of a tabernacle or a tent or some sort of a semi-permanent shelter, we would say. He's not saying we're going to build you stone temples with golden pillars, and he's not saying we're going to, pitch a tent exactly. It's a sort of a semi-permanent structure for what that's worth. And of course, the idea of using the word tabernacle, I think in the King James translation, was intentional by the translators at that time to evoke the tabernacle of Moses, right? Prior to the temple being built all the way through King David up until Solomon, there was only one place to go and worship the Lord, which was at the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, which was prescribed in the law of Moses. Much like the kings being sort of a concession made by God when he intended for them to have judges, the temple is sort of a concession made by God to his King David and his descendants, because the original plan, of course, what was written in the law was the tabernacle, right? If you go back and read the instructions in Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, of all the things that were going on, and some of the stuff in Leviticus as well, a lot of those rules are just like, here's how to build a tent. not a temple, but a tent. So I think when the translators were looking at this, oh, build a tent here for you, Jesus, they heard tabernacle. And that's why they use that word. Okay, comments or questions so far on this verse and some of the context we've got for it here? I do think it's interesting that the other aspect to this, of course, is what would happen when Moses went into the tent of meeting. He would go in, and he'd come back out, and his face would be glowing, and he'd wear the veil, right? And so this idea that Jesus, glowing as he was, transfigured in verse 2, right above where we read here, Peter is... I don't know if this is part of what he's considering or not, but he's sort of saying, that's where the glory of God goes, is behind a veil away from human eyes. But Jesus, of course, here is playing in front of their faces, showing the glory of God shining through him.
We know from verse 3 that Peter always, out of all the disciples that we've read about so far, the most ambitious one.
Sure.
And he's in an excited state right now because of what he just witnessed happen.
Absolutely.
So he wants to do something to mark the event.
I definitely don't think there's any sort of self-aggrandizing or sort of, Peter's motives are almost entirely pure here. They're just off from what God has intended, probably.
We can see, we're starting to see the change of direction now from the old to the new.
Sure.
And how we honor the old leaders like Moses and Elijah under the Old Testament rule. The tide's changing here with Christ.
No doubt.
And, the next few verses we're going to get a kind of bring to a point. This is my beloved son. Listen to him. He asks.
Absolutely. Well, and this is kind of Peter's section of the book, isn't it? We've just got his confession of Christ and then the get behind me, Satan episode. And now we're getting to Peter saying, oh, it's good that we're here. Let me build you a tabernacle. Let me build you a tent.
I think, we often fault Peter, but really, you gotta admire, especially him and the early disciples in their early part with Christ. You gotta admire his audacity. You gotta admire his fervor, his enthusiasm.
Absolutely.
Because down the road, he's going to need it.
Well, and I think one thing we've been saying a lot as we've been doing this particular study of this book, but something that we always talk about when we're reading scriptures is, why was this recorded? What's the lesson for us? And I think the reason why Peter gets, to borrow a sort of a modern phrase, so much screen time, why we see so much of Peter's activity, is because he's sort of a stand-in for us in a lot of cases, where at least the good aspect of it is we ought to have the same level of enthusiasm. Like, okay, God, let's go. I'm ready. Well, I have ideas. Let's try something out. Also the ways that Peter kind of gets humbled from time to time, where God shows him, all right, well, I see where you're going, but here's where I need you to be, This stepping out of the boat too soon is a great testament to Peter's initial faith in Jesus, but also to the amount of help we actually need from God to do the things that he tells us. Sure, go ahead and come do it with me. And the same goes for this place as well. Jesus brought Peter with him for a reason. And Matthew wrote what Peter said for a reason. And that might be because a lot of times we have an idea in our head of how to honor God, but we need to listen to what God actually says. Absolutely. So let's go ahead and read verse 5 and see God's response to, well, maybe not God's response, but rather God's statement that Peter sort of preempted with his suggestion. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." All right, we'll get the disciples' reaction in just a moment, but this is one of those passages where it's easy to go step by step through the verses because there's a lot to say on each one. One thing right away, what's some of the language that's being used here? Jesus was shining like the sun. His clothes are just as white as the light. And then when God's presence appears here, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Now, I don't want to make too much out of nothing. So if I'm sort of making a big deal out of something that's not really in the text here, I apologize. But the thing that struck me as I was reading this and preparing was it doesn't bother to say, "And then God arrived, and God started speaking to them," because God was already there, right? Jesus is already God in that sense. But what I mean is that the Lord doesn't need to make any distinction between his presence and his creation. He only does that for our benefit, right? So when God was up on the mountain, we were talking about Moses, and we were probably going to keep talking about Moses. Everybody was afraid. People didn't even want to look up to the mountain, right? They built that idol to distract themselves from what was going on up there with Moses. And when Moses came and he had a little trace of the Lord's presence, his face was glowing, they said, "Well, just cover that up. We don't want to look. It's too much for us." But it wasn't that God was in the pillar of fire or in the pillar of smoke or that he was on the mountain. God just showed himself in all of those things. Like, God wasn't in the burning bush. He was just showing his presence to Moses in the burning bush. He wasn't any less in the holy ground Moses was standing on than he was in the burning bush, right? He's not any less in the air that we breathe than he was on the cross, thousands of years ago. So I think that's, like I said, I don't want to make too much out of nothing here, but the idea that when Matthew was recording this, he didn't say, God arrived, but rather a cloud covered them. Which, again, sounds a lot like what was happening on the mountain when Moses got the law, right? There was a cloud around the mountain at that time, too. But rather than getting, 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets, we instead get this one very simple statement. "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." There's only one commandment there, right? Listen to Jesus. So.
I think we've read this over and over again in our lifetime. As children, you hear the Bible stories. But to try to put it into context, how spectacular an event this was.
Yeah.
First, the Transfiguration. The glow, Christ's face glowing, and then to hear the booming voice of God, correct Peter, correct them. This is my beloved son, whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And it had to be, let's say, a terrifying moment. It was terrifying to him. And it was probably extremely loud. Can you picture yourself being there, witnessing the Transfiguration, and then also above you coming down is a loud voice? What a spectacular thing.
It would be completely overwhelming.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. It's not really any surprise at all when we read their reaction there in verse 6. The disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground terrified. I mean, what else are you going to be given that situation? It's not something you take in stride. You know, a lot of times, I'm kind of critical of people who will look at biblical figures and say, well, I don't know what I would do if I was in this situation. I could never go through that, blah, 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 blah. If I was in this situation, I don't think I have to make any distinction between myself and the apostles. I think I would have had the exact same reaction. Yeah, I mean, because, you know, like sometimes we'll say, well, I don't think I could have been like Abraham and take my son and offer him as a sacrifice. You know, you know, even though Isaac came back with him, I don't think I could even obey God to go follow that call. Well, I've heard people say that. Well, we can have a conversation about whether that's appropriate or not, but the whole point of what I'm saying is, when we look at situations like this, if Jesus put me on that mountain with him and Moses and Elijah, and the cloud surrounded me, I think my face would be on the ground in honor and worship and awe and terror all at once. I think I'd have the exact same reaction in this moment. And Jesus' response to them into their appropriate, you know, fear as far as a human reaction to this goes is interesting too. Let's go and read verse 7. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. And when they got up, they saw no one except Jesus. Comments or questions?
Just casual to Jesus. Like the whole thing's amazing to us, and he's like, pick it up. I mean,
Don't be afraid. Yeah.
Well, he's acting as a comforter here now.
Sure.
You know, get up, come on, you know, don't be afraid.
I will say, in times when I'm upset, the fewer words you say to me, the more comforted I am. If you've got a whole speech I got to pay attention to, I'm out. Like, I'm done. But if all you say is, it's going to be okay, let's go, blah, 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 just a few simple words that I can just immediately click right into my brain, then it's going to be a lot more effective. And I think if these guys are having this strong of an emotional response, that they fall face down to the ground terrified in this posture of like worship and terror. And God, you know, Jesus came and said, now hear thee, this I must say unto thee, and, you know, had 10 pages worth of red letter text for us to read. We would all skip over that and go, okay, well, yeah, sure, I'm sorry she had something. But all he said very simply was, get up and don't be afraid. So sometimes Jesus needs to say a lot when it's time to teach somebody. I think this is probably a good example for us just in life too. But sometimes when you need to comfort somebody, the less you say, the more effective it is. I think another example of that could be, you know, when we're dealing with children, you know, if you're a kid and you're scared, especially if you're very young, and somebody's coming and talking to you with a lot of complicated words, not only are you going to have to work to try and understand what they're saying, probably, especially if they're really trying to be adult and complicated about it, but your emotions are going to be high. It's going to be hard to listen. But if the answer is get up, don't be afraid, you can try and do that for right now. You can try not to be afraid right now. You can be brave for a few minutes at least, because that's a simple enough thing to understand. Comments or questions so far? There's a lot to talk about, as I said, in this, but there's one last thing I want to touch on in the few minutes we have left of our class before we conclude here. We're seeing Another echo of something Old Testament-y here in what's going on. Obviously, the parallels to Moses on the mountain are there. We've already talked about those. But if we go back even further, we see one of the sort of biblical symbols of God being brought up again here, which is that, and we talked about this in a previous class, but it's worth touching on again here when we get to the bright cloud, which is that God and light are connected to each other, right? From the very first thing that happens in Genesis, God speaks and there is light. That's the first thing that we see, the first quality of God that we see. And it's not because light-colored things, white things, represent purity. It's not because, there's this sort of, like, dark is, dirty and light is pure, but rather that, as we talked about before, when you want to do something that can be seen, you do it in the light, and when you want something to be hidden, you do it in the dark. And even though this is only taking place with, the four of them, well, the six of them, if you include Moses and Elijah, standing there on this mountain, the transfiguration takes place here, and light is what shows them the change, shows them who Jesus is. There is one other thing that I will say really quickly. This is just an aside, so you can just tune out if you're already done listening to me for this morning, at least for the class. Pay attention to when I'm preaching if you don't want. But every time I see pictures of this, anytime anybody illustrates this, they always make it at night. Have you noticed that? Now, I think that's just artistically you can see the light better at night. There's like a contrast. It's to show something. This is me just being picky and silly about this, but it doesn't say what time of day this takes place, at least not in Matthew's account. And I didn't have the forethought to go and check and see if some Mark or Luke or John mentions this happening at a particular time of the day. But how much more striking would it be that if it's in broad daylight that Jesus takes him up on this mountain and he's glowing so brightly that he outshines the sun, and that the cloud surrounds them, the cloud's so bright that it's brighter inside the cloud than outside. That would have some sort of impact to me. So the whole point of what I'm saying there is it doesn't matter whether this takes place at night or day, but that sort of light aspect is what's important there. Okay. Now, if you check me on that later on, you go read your other translations, the other Gospels, what I mean to say, and you find a time of day it shows up. Maybe those artists are right. But I was only looking at Matthew when I was getting ready for class this morning, and so that was what was on my mind. All right, well, thank you for your kind attention this morning. We will resume in just a few moments with our regular worship service.